Okay, so this is the TPCASTT system for analyzing poetry. Essentially what this is an acronym. And if you sort of go through the acronym as you approach a poem, you sort of build towards identifying theme and identify items in the poem that help develop theme over the course of the text, which will greatly help us with our literary analysis tasks and identifying the emergence of theme. So like I said, each letter in TPCASTT is part of an acronym. The first T stands for title. And what we're doing here is just looking at the title of the poem. And based on the title of the poem, what do you think the poem is going to be about? Also, what from the title leads you to believe this? And are there any words from the title that are ambiguous? What else could they mean? For example, we looked at the poem Digging. Digging has lots of different interpretations, different ways that it could be used. What are all those different ways that it could be used, and how could that lend themselves? How could those definitions lend themselves to different things that the poem might be about? So for this presentation, we're going to look at a poem called Introduction to Poetry by Billy Collins. So for Introduction to Poetry, you have to ask, what could it mean? So I came up with a few things. The first, the poem might offer an explanation of poetry. It might very well just give you an introduction to poetry. Additionally, the poem might be about giving an introduction, an explanation, and the poem might be about a class called Introduction to Poetry. Now, the next step is to read the poem, and this is very much the most important step in reading and analyzing poetry. If you can't read the poem, or if you don't read the poem, then you really just have no chance at understanding what it is going to be about. So read the poem out loud. You want to listen to the way the poem sounds. You want to listen to the words that the poet uses in the way that the poem is structured. Think about what you notice. What sounds do you hear? What ideas stick out to you? And what words or phrases help develop meaning over the course of the text? Last but not least, how does the poem look? Now, we will probably not read any concrete poems, but the way that a poem is structured is important. Is it divided into stanzas? How many lines are in a stanza? Is it one entire long stanza? Are there enjambed lines? There are lots of different ways that a poem can look, and that can help us take a look at the meaning. So this is the poem Introduction to Poetry by Billy Collins, and I will go ahead and read it. I asked them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore, but all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. The next thing we're going to do, the next letter is P, and P stands for paraphrase. Paraphrasing is a skill that we have worked on a little bit in here, but sort of will develop as we move through this course. And when we are paraphrasing, we are simply putting the text into our own words. We're taking what the author says and restating it and using our own words. So this is not a summary. Rather, you should focus on chunks of text. I'm not looking for the entire poem is about this. I'm looking for this section of the poem is about this. Now, typically, poems are divided into stanzas, and if so, paraphrasing should be done by stanzas. Stanza 1, stanza 2, stanza 3, stanza 4. You want to avoid copying the text. Paraphrasing should be your words. A lot of times you may say, well, it just says what it says. It's very straightforward. But you also have to think about how you can put those things into your own words. Additionally, you want to avoid analysis. We'll get into analysis a little bit later. But ultimately, we want to just simply rephrase the text. And this will allow us to understand how the poem progresses and what ideas are in the poem. And then later on, we can start to think about why those ideas are actually in the poem. So for example, we have the first stanza, I asked them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide. If we're looking at a paraphrase, we might include something along the lines of the speaker of the poem, I ask the them of the poem to look at the poem with an extra light. Now, this is very straightforward. It's really just focused on the ideas of the poem. Next, or press an ear against its hive. Here, we have the speaker simply wanting the them of the poem, the students of the poem, to listen to the poem like it was a beehive. How does the poem sound? And then last but not least, they begin beating it with the hose to find out what it really means. We see that at the end of the poem, these last two lines, the student tortured the poem to get it to tell them the message. This idea that they are physically abusing the poem in order to get the message from it. C stands for connotation. We know that connotation is an idea or feeling that a word invokes in addition to its literal or primary meaning. Here we are mainly looking at figurative language and word choice. We will get into figurative language later on next week and cover a lot of things like metaphor and simile and hyperbole and symbolism and imagery. I'll also talk about alliteration, assonance, consonants, and types of rhyme. But really here we're working on identifying them and then also identifying the ways in which the author uses them. Why are they using them? What effect do they have on the poem, and do they help create meaning? So for introduction to poetry, we're going to look at figurative language first. And there's quite a bit of figurative language in here, mainly metaphor. So for metaphor, we can look at a couple. First is press an ear against its hive. Here we sort of have the speaker suggesting that he wants the students to press their ear against the poem, to listen to the way it sounds, similar to the way you would press your ear against the hive of a bee. You hear the word, you hear the sounds of the poem. Next, he says, I want them to water ski across the surface of the poem. Here we have the speaker wants students to have fun with the poem, to enjoy reading the poem. Skiing is a leisure activity, something that you do for fun. And that's the way that the speaker of the poem wants his students to approach poetry. Next, we have word choice. And I just picked a couple out here in the last two stanzas. Torture, confession, beating. All these have a negative impact on how we view the poem. It's very much pairs with this idea of torturing the poem, of beating it, and really sort of contrast with what we see in the four stanzas prior to these last two stanzas. So sort of this word choice here at the end of the poem really has an impact. Next, we have the attitude or the tone of the poem. What is the tone? What is the attitude towards the subject? And we certainly are not limited to one tone, one attitude, and we're going to explore many throughout the poem. And we also want to identify what from the poem conveys this tone, right? So if you say something is hopeful or depressing, what from the poem led you to believe that? And a great picture there of Dr. Evil. So attitude for introduction to poetry. And I would say that in the first 5 stanzas of the poem, the speaker is hopeful, right? He wants his students to enjoy poetry. He's telling them, listen to the way it sounds, see how it looks, walk inside the poem as if you were looking for a light switch, feel around and get a better idea of the poem. This is what he wants the students to do, and he wants them to enjoy poetry. He says things like hold it to the light, press an ear against its hive, walk around, water ski across it. In the last two stanzas, the speaker is resigned, right? He knows that the students want to tie the poem to a chair and beat it with the rubber hose until the meaning becomes clear. And this is absolutely what he wants the students not to do. Next, we have shift. Now, shift is exactly what it sounds like. We are looking for changes in the poem, specifically changes in time. Like, does the poem jump between different time periods? Does it jump between different points in the day? Does it start in the morning and end at night? Are there changes in tone? Anywhere in the poem, does the attitude change? Does the subject change? Or the attitude towards the subject change? And last but not least is the speaker. Is there more than one speaker in the poem?